Okay, well, welcome everyone. This call, as some of our committee members may recall, was really in response to the recognition that at the last meeting, there were a number of topics that required deeper discussion. And we were recognizing that we were all kind of coming in with different experience bases, different knowledge bases. And in order to actually do our role, collective role of ultimately putting forward a set of recommendations for our board, we need to actually level set and have a lot more shared knowledge about the topics that we're charged to inform and ultimately set some recommendations around. And so this is that conversation. I've worked really closely with Thomas to prepare for today, and I will say, because he won't say this himself, Thomas has done an incredible job just synthesizing our last discussion and really trying to prioritize the various topics that are going to enable us to build our knowledge together. So thank you, Thomas, for all your leadership and leading into this conversation. I'd like to give it to you to sort of lay out how we've made some choices about what we're going to prioritize today in terms of deep dives and what we're not and why. And then, of course, open it up to work group members to see if there's anything you would amend to that.
Sounds great. Thanks so much. Also wanted to share, some of you have met Amelia Urban before. She is on the call. She is our Director of Accountability Policy here at the department. We're really excited that she'll be joining this conversation. She does many things at the department around accountability policy. She'll chime in from time to time during the call, and we welcome that. And she'll also be our chief note taker to support me, because I did it in the last meeting and did a less than great job, but I know Amelia is going to do an awesome job. The next, let's see if I can get my computer to work. Perfect. Real quick review of actions out of the last meeting. I sent Dr. Davis yesterday some additional documents on the value added model and the progress index, so she can dig into that between now and the next meeting. I developed a set of case studies. I sent a draft to Mr. Morris, I guess Friday of last week. He looked at them, and we're going to keep refining those, but you're going to see some of those today around the progress index and the assessment index and how those two things fit together. I also went online and pulled some examples of how other states have implemented accountability. That'll be in the appendix of this slide deck for you all to review. That's from CCSO. They've got a pretty cool website that shows a lot of that and a report for you all to look at. Two items that are still on that to-do list are high school incentives and how do we value CTE comparatively to college credentials, and data points around those awarded, points that are awarded when kids decrease on the progress index. In service of all of that, one of the things that was requested was a tracker that kind of talks through the issue topic. What does it focus on? I've added a column for specific champions, somebody who might be focused on that issue and can support us, next steps, and ultimately a status, and then an outcome so that we know what the decision was or what we need to do going forward. I will share this Excel spreadsheet with folks. I can't share the Google Sheet so that it's live, but we'll keep this tracker active and going as the conversation goes on. You see it's got 19 rows minus 3, so 16 items on it at this point, and that'll just keep growing. And this was a request to Mr. Morris that I think is spot on and great, and it'll help us get through this much faster. Any questions on that, Mr. Morris, since this was an item that you brought up last time?
Ronnie, you might be muted if you're speaking.
Okay, hearing none, we'll come back to it if we need to. Okay. So we're going to do two things, and we're going to try to stick to some good time here. Let me pull this agenda back up. The first 30 minutes, we want to talk about the student growth measure because folks have gotten various levels of that in the past, individually, one-on-one. and some whole group on how the growth measure works. So we'll do about 30 minutes on that. And we want to arrive at some next steps that we want to study and plan for the next meeting to really spend a lot of time on that. So 30 minutes there. Then we want to spend 60 minutes talking about the rigor of the high school formula, how it works, and also come up with what our next steps are there. And then ultimately talk about overall next steps around all of our work together. And our next meeting will continue to focus on student growth, the high school formula, and the feedback and input gathering process and timeline. And it sounds like Mr. Morris is having issues with his microphone. So if you want to keep communicating with us in the chat, Mr. Morris, for now, that's how I think we can move forward. Does that sound good to you, Ms. Orange Jones?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Perfect. So as we review these case studies on how student achievement and improvement outcomes are recognized in the formula, we want to focus on a handful of questions. Does the grade the school earned for this student reflect the work done by the school and teacher? Are there students for whom the school can never achieve more than an F regardless of how much incremental or comparative progress they make? And should we consider changes to either of those two things? Y'all seen this before. It just kind of walks through the way that progress index is calculated. If students meet their growth to mastery target, or as we refer to it sometimes, step 1, they get 150 points on the growth index. If they don't do that, we look at what percentile they perform in, and based off of their percentile, we award points, and you see those on the right, 80th to 99th percentile, 150 points, all the way down to no points for the 1st to 19th percentile. If a student's mastery, we always give them 85 points. And a little backstory on VAM, it looks at student characteristics, and some of those characteristics are listed there. So the case study, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but essentially we modeled out if each student was the only student in the school, what would the points have been that the school would have gotten for that student based off their achievement and their growth. So you will see that on the next few slides. I think that I put 4 of these in here for us to kind of look at. So our first student scores advanced. They get 150 points for assessment. Because the student scored advanced, they also automatically got 150 points on the progress index. Overall, the school gets 150 points, or an A, on both the current and the future letter grade scale. That makes sense and is pretty straightforward. Now we're going to get into a place where math is going to happen. So achievement level for a student that is mastery, they get 100 points on the assessment index. Even though the student scored in the 40th to 59th percentile, which would not have gotten them a whole bunch of points, they got an 85 floor for their progress, which overall translates to them getting about 96 points for that student, which is an A on that current scale, or on the future scale, a B, because it's less than 100. Any questions so far? Thoughts, reactions?
Thomas, can you just say one more sentence about this? Even though the student scored in the 40th to 59th percentile, the student earned a floor of 85 points. So how did they score in the 40th to 59th percentile?
Right. So this particular student, right, they would have gotten points in step 2 of the VAM. This 40th to 59th percentile, they actually would have earned 85 points, but if they had fallen in the 20th to 39th percentile, which you'll probably see in another case study, they could not have fallen below 85. That was the lowest they could have gone, even if they had scored in the 20th to 39th percentile, only better than 20% of the students in the state. They would have gotten 85 points in the formula. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Next set. So a student scores basic, means they earn 80 points for assessment. The student earned 150 points for growth if they met step 1. So this student overall would earn the school an SPS of 98. Even though the student got basic, they did really great on step 1 of growth, or that did they meet their growth to mastery target And they would have overall gotten an SPS of 98, which would have been an A on the current scale and a B on the future scale. So overall, the student didn't get to mastery, but because they met their incremental growth toward mastery, they do wind up earning the school currently A-level achievement growth combined. Any questions there? Okay, and you're going to see a very similar situation play out for the student who's basic and grows in the 60th to 79th percentile. So I'm not going to go through that one, though you are seeing that their score overall, the study at 89, is lower than that 98 because the growth was significantly less. Now we get into some interesting ones that I think will start a conversation when we start talking about this. So a student scores approaching basic. So they get 0 points for assessment. They get nothing on the assessment side, which is 75%, give or take, depending on the school's configuration. The student, if they're in step 1, they met their growth to mastery target, or they're in that top set of percentiles, they would get 150 points. But overall, that school would still only get 39, an SPS of 39 for that student, or an F, regardless of how good their growth was. They would have only gotten less than a 40 on their overall score for that student. Any thoughts, reflections here?
Do others have any questions on this one? This gets into some of the conversations we were having in the last meeting.
Can I ask a question just so that I can make sure I've got this, the growth to mastery stuff down pat as we're going through this? So let's say I have student A who his growth to mastery goal is 3 points every year. I have student B whose growth to mastery is 8 points every year. All right. So student A, let's say student A got their 3 points, so they meet their progress goal, but student B only grew 6 points, but not the 8th. And so that student then doesn't earn the points for growth because they did not meet their goal, even though they actually grew more than student A, because they grew 6 points, but they didn't meet the goal that was set for them. Is that correct?
That's correct. The first student that you described would be they met step 1, which is absolute growth to mastery. They needed 3 points, they grew 3 points. The second one would then go into step 2, which would line them up with all the other students based on the amount they exceeded what was the VAM model expected that they would achieve. And they get points based off the percentile that they're in.
So just so we're clear, right? Like then what we're really doing with the first step is punishing schools that have a bunch of low-income children who are showing up not ready to learn at kindergarten, right? And so our schools that are serving our most disadvantaged students are automatically being harmed in our first step because they're going to have to grow more, right? What we expect of them is larger each year that they're in school than somebody like one of my kids that's showing up and is already, advanced or whatever. I mean, is that an incorrect way of looking at what we're doing at step 1?
Step 1 definitely does not take into account anything about student characteristics. So step 1 just is how far do they have to go? And that's how far do they have to go and how many years do they have to get there? Then that is just the straight up way that it works. So the farther students are from their goal, the more points they have to get each year, which is harder.
Okay, so we're asking more of our kids that are serving, kids that are showing up, the ones that we know are showing up not ready for kindergarten, essentially. And this is my opinion, right? The deck is stacked against them from step 1 forward. And that's me sharing my opinion. I can, people can disagree with me on that one, but the schools that are educating kids that aren't ready for kindergarten, we're asking them to do more than you're asking the kids, the schools like at a magnet program, for instance.
Thomas, is this why there's a step 2?
Their step 2 certainly seeks to take into account and kind of level that playing field a little bit, but I won't disagree with Dr. Davis that step 1 is stacked against anyone who serves a student population who has a longer distance to go in order to get to mastery, because it is absolute. It is how many points do you have divided by the number of years. So yes, I don't disagree with what she's saying. And step 2, the VAM seeks to correct for that. That's absolutely right, Ms. Ornstein.
I guess
Okay.
the question is whether or not we think step 2 actually does that, which I guess we'll get into as we move forward. Thanks, Thomas. I appreciate you making sure I knew what I was, or I had that understood correctly.
Yeah, and that's absolutely why we wanted to do this exercise, was to kind of elicit these thoughts and dig into this some more. So you'll see the same exact thing with the unsatisfactory, the student who's performing at an unsatisfactory level. The highest they can get is 39 points for that kid, even if they are growing that kid at the amount that they need to in order to get that kid to mastery. So they might, by the time that kid gets to middle school, if they've done everything, they might get to a place where they're going to get to a place where they can earn points to A level or B level. But for those first few years with that student, they are going to struggle because that student, no matter how good they do, they're going to get F level points for that. They'll get an A in the progress
index. Because the student is still at approaching basic.
Correct. And the school gets no points for that. They get 0. And that's 70% or 65% of their score. And then they might get 150, but that's 25% of the score. So it becomes really, really hard for them when you add those two things together and do a weighted average. It's impossible to get above an F. It's just not possible. So discussion next steps. The thing that I asked y'all to kind of look at and y'all started to hone in on was, does it reflect the work done by the school? Is it possible for a school to get out of that F range regardless of how much progress they make for certain students based off their performance? So I put some conversation starters on the right side to just kind of get us going. Should meeting growth targets towards standard be recognized? This is a conversation that I've heard various folks, board members, non-board members, share with us. Should it be incremental, percent of target met? What if they exceed that expectation? What if they get 175% of a target? So that's the first kind of thing that I threw out there. Curious for reactions and happy to add anything to this list.
I would love to hear. Sandy, do you want to start us off? What does this make you think?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I was reflecting within a school and even as educators, how much work educators do. And the downside of all of this is you work so hard and then you don't get that credit for moving a kid from one step to the other, to the next. And it's I guess discouraging. And if this is the area that we want to encourage or incentivize, we may want to take a deeper look or dive into this. I know it's very difficult on the accountability side to show that you want a kid to get to mastery level, but to really encourage and incentivize, I think it's a good avenue for us or to navigate. But I don't know the percentage of scores. I'm not up with that, but I just know the feeling out there.
Thomas, can you speak to that?
Can I ask a question? real quick, Karen? This kind of gets at
Yeah.
what I asked on
Yeah.
my criticism of step one. From what it looked like that Thomas described in some of those scenarios, even for a school, when you get to step two, right? So if step two is supposed to be where we reward the schools that are moving kids, even though they're showing up really far behind and not ready to learn, it looks to me as if that last case scenario that Thomas talked about basically says that, okay, that kindergarten, that elementary school could have that child meet their growth to mastery target every year that they're at the elementary school, but they still get an F for that child because they don't grow to mastery while they're at that elementary school. Is that correct, Thomas?
Yeah, for their first year at least, right? That student who their first year in third grade was at unsatisfactory, in that second year, it's impossible unless they far exceed that growth to mastery target and get the student beyond that unsatisfactory rating. You're absolutely right.
Is this one of the reasons we see K-8 schools, like their letter grades, if I'm remembering correctly, they tend to fare better than our K to fifth grade? Is that because some of those schools are actually able to capture their work, because the child is at that school longer, or am I off base on that?
That's certainly a large part of it, right? If you are meeting your growth to mastery targets and you are growing kids, you're going to see that really pay off in those middle school grades. There's the second factor that comes in with schools that have eighth grade, because they also have 5% that is additionally non-achievement based and non-progress based, based off of their eighth graders going to ninth grade. How many credits did they earn? That's 5%. And it's, on average over 100 points each school earns for that. So eighth grade, schools with eighth grade are benefiting from that also, but in large part, it is the other thing that you described as well.
And so that question kind of gets in even to a little bit to some of the discussions we're going to have later about high school, right? There's all this angst out there that high schools appear to have higher letter grades than our elementary and middle school. Well, in part, that's a function of how we have designed the steps 1 and step 2 in a way that penalizes a whole lot of our elementary schools that are educating kids, that are showing up not ready for kindergarten. So it's not necessarily maybe that we're being too easy on our high schoolers, but perhaps the way we're grading our elementary schools is not accurately reflecting the work that they're doing, to get to Sandy's point.
If I may add to this, that we should see a significant increase in performance, because now our third grade educators won't have the burden of trying to do beyond the measure of educating our students, because our K1 and 2 educators will now have accountability. And so our students will hopefully perform better and have greater success because of the accountability coming in for K1 and 2, and not have our third and fourth and further grades have that struggle, the burden to educate our students to that level.
Yeah, I think the next bullet that I threw in here around an eighth grader, right? Like, should extraordinary growth comparatively be recognized? When you look at an eighth grader and they are at approaching basic, right now the school's getting 0 points in the assessment index for that student. If that's the student's first year at that school, how should that school be measured? Because if they're an eighth grader, currently, if the school doesn't get that kid to mastery, growth says on an absolute measure, you don't get any growth points on step 1, because the growth to mastery is getting the kid to mastery. So this one, I think, kind of elicits a question like, how do you handle these individual cases where a student isn't at mastery, arrives at the school, and the school has a very short runway in order to get them to mastery under our current formula? And I'm curious what folks think there.
Well, I mean, I do think, Thomas, I think that that's problematic, right? And I think it's problematic. There are probably a lot of our schools that have, that have high rates of poverty are going to have very mobile student populations. And it appears to me that that's one more way we're not recognizing the work that they're doing.
I mean, we must have data on this, right? Like, what percentage of students are in this situation?
We certainly can pull that.
Is it like a big number? Like, is it like, I'm just trying to scope it. Does that
Yeah, I don't think that this particular kid is the one that we're trying to solve for, but I think that it paints a good picture around exactly what Dr. Davis was saying earlier. Like, are there cases in which you look at the trajectory of like how far the student has to go and you think about it a little bit differently than just this absolute incremental, they grow this much each year?
Yeah.
It's worth looking at these edge cases to see if it kind of points to something that we should do for other cases that are actually pretty large, which third graders not being at mastery is a large group of kids.
Yeah. That's right.
So here are some conversation starters, right? Like, I've heard folks say you could do incremental points for students below mastery. I've heard people say you could do incremental points for partial attainment of your growth to mastery target. You could do weighted growth higher for students in earlier grades.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other like things that just jump out at people that we should start to explore? Because our next steps are going to be for Ms. Orange-Jones, Mr. Morris, and maybe Dr. Davis, if you're interested, to connect together and just start to think through these like next steps around what do we want to study here.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from other members who we haven't weighed in on. This feels like an important area of study. Michael, is there anything you'd like to see added?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Since I wasn't at the last meeting, I'm going back and reading things to make sure I'm catching up on everything. One of the things, well, I'm looking at my email right now where I kind of talked to some people about this. Has there been in our discussions for going forward conversations that, and goes into the growth part of it where, look, we understand that right now the current model makes it impossible for somebody to reach or receive points and stuff, but something where if you're going up half a proficiency level, where you can get points for that, where you may not reach that whole next level, but you may go from unsatisfactory to approaching basic and give somebody some points in the growth aspect of it for that, where, and I think this goes to Dr. Davis' concern, you may get a kid that comes in so far behind that they're never going to get the points, but have we discussed changing it or tweaking it so they can get maybe not the full points if you reach the mastery level, but some sort of reward for acknowledging the kids that are unsatisfactory and you get them to approaching basic. You need to get some. Was that discussed? What, am I missing that?
No, that's a great flag, and we can dig into that over the next couple weeks before the next meeting.
Okay, because I think that, and Dr. Davis, correct me, but I think that would kind of address part of your concern where you have a kid that just comes in and if they're in third grade, the odds of them getting to mastery by the time they're in fifth are not very great. But if you did something like that where you tiered it a little bit, assuming they did show the progress, you could reward them by giving them some, just to get that data or some, I don't know how many kids that is, but it would be a tweak where you're rewarding actual progress, but at the same time acknowledging you're not at mastery where we would like you.
And Thomas, just to track Michael's last point, is that the same as the second bullet point?
It could be somewhere between the second one and the third one. I'm thinking about like the what his end goal seems to be, which is to find a way to like split this down the middle and say, okay, there are some students for whom it is a really like long run to get to mastery, and how do we recognize that in the short run? And you could do that through weighting growth for students in earlier grades or students who are lower performing, right? You could weight their growth more than students who are higher performing. But I kind of understand where he's going with this. And I think that if we take a couple weeks, we can get a good set of analyses together. Yeah,
and Thomas, one other thing is even within a group, so let's take it approaching basics. Say a kid comes in and just scrapes in and they barely meet that approaching basics. But by the end of the year, they're at the very top of the approaching basics. So basically they went an entire level, but they were just 1 point into approaching basic at the end and then 1 point from getting into basic at the end. Is there a point where we can say, look, if you cross the midpoint of a grade or of a level, you get some points for doing and break it down even more where you're truly saying you're going to get points for some stuff. You may not get the full point if you progress to the next level, but actually rewarding them with some sort of acknowledgement that you did progress this child and this student, which at the end of the day, I think everybody wants is for it to be an accurate reflection of growth. And it seems like we're talking about here, focusing just on that growth aspect.
Yeah, we could certainly look at that and actually see, we could actually look at the bands and how far kids are moving on average by bands and start to inform some of that modeling. So give us a couple weeks and we'll get through that. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Thomas, is there any way, if this is like a big ask, then totally ignore it, but is there a way to get the distribution of our growth to mastery numbers for kids in the third grade? So is the average kid in Louisiana expected to grow 5 points a year? And then we have like a big chunk of kids where we actually are asking them to grow 10 or 12. And so that we can get an idea of kind of the number of kids we have that I'm worried about, that are having to grow these really large numbers and their schools are not getting recognized for their work because they have to grow so many points each year.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll get that. We'll run it by achievement level and by subgroup so that you can kind of dig into both of those things.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Would it be helpful to parse out, I think, Thomas, you might have the best vantage point on this, what some of the other divergent perspectives on this particular dimension are, so that way while there seems to be some alignment amongst some committee members here, there's obviously a broader range of views on this. Can you just share some of the counter arguments so that we are, as a committee, sort of aware of other ways of thinking about this particular dimension?
Of course. I think that I know that there are people who feel really passionately about VAM, and there are some people who feel that VAM lowers expectations on particular groups of students. I think that is a narrative that is out there that I think is worth keeping an eye on and thinking about, while also thinking about how to do this in a way that fairly recognizes student achievement and takes into account what we know about where students start, and really thinking about, to Dr. Davis's point, like how far does that school need to move that student to be recognized in some way, and also make sure that the incentives are aligned to push schools to do those things and do that hard work and reward it when it happens. So I think that that's like the biggest counterpoint that folks will put out there, that VAM lowers or changes expectations based off a student's characteristics.
Okay, thanks for laying that out. Any
Okay.
other big things to discuss here, or can we keep going? I say keep going.
Dr. Davis, are you willing to be part of that first bullet of next steps?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to dig into high school in a very similar way. And thank you, Ms. Orange Jones, for keeping us on schedule, because we are right on time. So as we look at the formulas, think about these topics. What do each of these formulas recognize? Is it appropriate? What key indicators do we want to see move in each of these grade spans? And are they the right things, but maybe not matching in rigor? So what's going on in the formula, and how do we make it better? Is it incentivizing the right things? And is it maybe just not hard enough, or accurate enough? You've seen these before, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But essentially, in the elementary grade span, you see 65 to 70% of the formula focused on assessment. And then in the high school, you only see about a third of that formula on assessment. And then the other half is graduation outcomes. And when I say assessment on the high school end, I'm including ACT in that percentage. So it's not even just LEAP. This distribution, this shows the number of the average index across the state for each of the indices. So you see the assessment index on the left for K-8, and then high school, you see high school assessment indices are a little bit higher than elementary school. That's to the point of students progressing and becoming more likely to be at mastery by the time they get to high school, just like they're more likely by the time they get to middle school. ACT index, you see just slightly higher than the high school index. Then you see the statewide SPS, which is the combination of K-8 and high school SPSs. Then you see the progress index, and you note that the high school progress index is a little bit less than the K-8 progress index. That's probably got to do with students not meeting their step 1 growth to mastery target in high school, because they've got 1 year essentially in order to get there, or 2. K-8, a little bit higher than high school, like I said. Grad outcomes, grad rate 90.4, strength of diploma 94.8, and then that 8th grade dropout credit accumulation index at 133. So you see overall the high school indices bear out higher scores than what's in the K-8 index, just as a takeaway. Any other reactions here?
Has this been pretty much the consistent since we've been tracking, like, meaning this is 2019, but would you have found the same thing the previous year as well?
Roughly.
Consistent. Yeah.
Pretty consistent. Okay, so this kind of shows the A through F distribution overall, including K through 12 schools. Then you can see elementary and middle schools, high schools, and then combination schools, which are elementary and middle school, elementary and high schools together. It just kind of shows you 37% of our high schools are A versus 11% of our elementary and middle schools. On down, and you see that there are more F elementary schools than there are F high schools. Same thing with D. So I wanted folks to have that as a frame of reference, and the previous slide to kind of explain partially why. Quick reactions here.
Can you just go ahead and headline this slide again, Thomas?
Sure. So what you see, let me get my mouse moving. There we go. So A schools overall 16%. That's the combination of elementary and middle schools, all rolled up together. Elementary schools, 11% of those are A's versus 37% of high schools. And then schools that are some combination of both elementary and high school, about 26% are A. So many fewer elementary schools are A's than high schools. And then you see a similar trend, many more, the opposite trend. many more elementary schools are Fs than high schools. Same thing with D. So you just see a pretty different distribution of those letter grades depending on grade configuration. And based off of this slide, that's not super surprising because assessment indices only make up about 1/3 of that high school formula versus on the elementary school side, it's over 60%. So if this was how the high school was being measured, it would look very similar in SPS, but that's not how that formula plays out because the formula is so heavily weighted in the elementary school side toward assessment compared to high school.
And that, in my opinion, that heavy weight on assessment is magnifies the effect of what we're doing wrong at the elementary level that we've already talked about, right, in the growth component, and how we're not recognizing the work that a lot of our elementary schools are doing with the way we're awarding points under the growth to mastery component of it.
Just wanted to quickly put up here the critical goals and priorities because we hope to talk through how high school and elementary school the accountability system can be aligned to these goals because many people believe that accountability systems should measure those things that are in your goals and drive toward that. So I wanted to put those top of mind. Kindergartners, students arrive kindergarten ready. By 3rd grade, they are achieving mastery and they're ready for 4th grade content. Same thing by 8th grade. Students graduating on time, students graduating with college and career credentials, and students graduating eligible for a TOPS award. So conversation starter, how can we make the high school more accurately incentivize and measure progress on our goals? And we just threw some conversation starters here, curious for people's reactions, things they would add, subtract, agree with, disagree with. And I can read through these and interrupt me as we go along. So students graduate on time. One thing that we don't measure is progress toward graduation in the high school formula. In a lot of ways, we just, a year after that cohort graduates, we look at it and we say, this percent of kids dropped out and this percent didn't. We don't look at how many of your 9th graders got to 10th grade, how many of your 10th graders got to 11th grade. We, 5 years later, after that 9th grader dropped out, we then assign points to that school. So it's a pretty significant lagging indicator. And as a result, we don't incentivize annual tracking of students to prevent dropouts annually. Any reactions there? Ways that we could think about incentivizing students graduating on time?
Well, I think I'd want to know more like why don't we do that currently?
Because the accountability formula only looks at the one measure, well, the 2 measures around high school graduation, both of which are the cohort itself at the end.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's just a question of, is this something that people want to explore?
Yeah.
Do we want to look at this on an ongoing basis? As we look at how do we make the formula more rigorous, one outcome of this would be schools would be measured twice for a dropout. They would be measured once when the student dropped out the first time, and then once at 4 years later when that student is supposed to graduate, did they get them back in and graduate them? So that's one way to think about the rigor of that high school formula, and also think about ways to adjust it to incentivize behaviors. Mr. Mellering.
Yeah. Colin, clarify this for me. Right now, when we're measuring dropout, is it the high school or is it the elementary or middle school? We're talking about if we measure 5 years later. The points are assigned into which school, lower or high school?
High school.
High school. Okay. That's what I thought. I was just clarifying. So if we switch it to add every year, we would then be, like you said, double incentivizing or double penalizing them if she drops out, right?
Mhm.
I may have another question. I'm trying to think of how to ask it.
No, this is perfect because I'm not proposing this, right? I'm just saying this is stuff, this is aligned to a goal, right? We want more students to graduate on time. And like, how do you incentivize that? Well, one way is to get schools through the accountability system to on an annual basis be looking at their dropouts. Doesn't need to be this solution, but it's one. And the goal is to just kind of get people going and talk about this. You're muted still.
There we go. Sorry. Okay, so my fear is if we start incentivizing and saying, look, you're going to penalize them by the year if they drop out, then you're going to incentivize students to just be kind of passed along. So that way they're not like they don't lose points because the kid drops out. They'll just say, stay in, we'll just pass you to the next grade. And I'm not saying it would happen. I'm just saying that's a potential drawback to doing this. And I don't know if anybody has a way to address that or has thought about that, is to prevent that from just somebody getting to the end and saying, well, they graduated, they get the diploma, but really they're not qualified, they don't have CTE readiness, they don't have college readiness, something like that. But it keeps the high school from being penalized because they dropped out. And I know we have that problem now, but that's just kind of the first glance, first thought. If we do this on a year-by-year basis, it may exacerbate that issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that the only way that we arrive at a really great accountability system is by looking at what are the unintended consequences. And then how do we make sure that we're coupling this, right? Like there is no world in which, well, that's not true. I would say that on average, this would not increase the high school letter grade. It would probably decrease it slightly because you're now counting them as a dropout twice. If you coupled that with an adjustment to the percent of points that are part of the EOC or the percent of points that are related to the ACT index, that might balance out what you're talking about, right? Like you're now saying we're going to hold you accountable here for keeping the kid in school, and we're going to hold you accountable even more for how well that student's prepared. So you like, how do we counter those unintended consequences that you're flagging, and also push people to do exactly what we want them to do? So I appreciate those things.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea if we do it, and I appreciate you thinking about it. I think that's a good idea. Because at the end of the day, it's not getting the kid out of high school, it's making sure they're ready once they get out to go to work, college, whatever they want to do. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, this is Shan. Also wanted to just remind the group that I had sent a statute that talks about the board including graduation rates in the formula. I can resend it, but it is mandated by statute that graduation rates be included, as well as international baccalaureate, advanced placement, and dual enrollment courses be part of the accountability system. So I just wanted to just revisit that.
Oh, absolutely. This would be additive. This would not be replacing that grad rate index.
Right. I just wanted to in case we started going there, I just wanted everyone to know that the statute actually says that the board and the state superintendent are charged with achieving a high school graduation of 80% by the end of 2013-14, and then to continually monitor that and reward schools or evaluate that on an annual basis and put it in the formula.
But Shan, does the statute tell us how to incentivize or the percentage of what a school should receive?
It doesn't. It just says the board shall revise the system to recognize schools and districts that improve their high school graduation rates.
Mm-hmm.
and complete programs. It doesn't, it kind of leaves it to us
Okay,
or
thank
to
you.
Bessie. I'm gonna send it again.
Thomas, let's keep moving through these, but can you speak to the ACT points? I think that could be.
Sure. So students will graduate eligible for a TOPS award. One thing that has been pointed out is that our ACT index is not necessarily aligned directly to what those TOPS eligibility requirements are, whereas our graduation pathways are aligned to those TOPS requirements. So one thing that we could do is we could realign the ACT points in the formula to what the things are that students earn money for in the scholarship program. And then lastly, students will graduate with a college and or career credential. Currently measured, the question is which type and how should we be incentivizing that or rewarding that? And then the readiness for the next step of life, ACT readiness, quality credential are things that we could look at. So conversation starters, ways to resolve some of those problems. You could increase, and these are again, like the last set, like just some things to get that conversation going. You could increase the weight of ACT, you could align it with college and career readiness and measure each sub-score instead of measuring just the overall score. You could align ACT expectations with TOPS requirements. You can identify ways to measure growth on the ACT when you increase that weight. You can implement rigorous dropout and credit attainment indices for each of the high school grades like we talked about. What else could we explore, think about, do differently in high school as we look at and study the high school experience and the way that high schools are graded compared to elementary schools?
Well, I think even before getting into like additive, this list is pretty rich as a starting point. I'd love to hear from work group members, like, of these notions that are here, what resonates. Is there anything that you're like, absolutely not, like this is not something I'd like to see explored at this point?
Hey, Kira, this is Ronnie. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, I'd like the group to consider maybe a little bit different approach instead of trying to get the problem solving, individual cases and one-offs and so forth, or just specific areas of interest. If maybe the group would consider a different approach and make an effort to define each letter grade with specific criteria. So what distinguishes an A school from a B school and a B from a C, and so forth. And then once you establish the criteria for each letter grade, then we can start talking about the hurdles that are in place that are keeping schools or students from achieving that next letter grade. And I have two examples. One would be Shan's point about statute compliance. So there are certain things that have to be considered. Another one would be this notion that if you look at the cases that Thomas submitted, personally, I don't see how a school can have an SPS of an F if their growth score is an A. I mean, what more can you do to ask of a teacher than to grow a student, 1 year? And if they've done that, how can you give them an F? So, specific criteria like that would at least help to set the boundaries for that A through F scale. And then once we've got those expectations set, then we could start talking about, like I said, hurdles, for achieving each one, as well as incentives to move students from one to another.
So Ronnie, maybe make it a little bit more concrete, at least for me, like just walk us through, and we won't hold you to it, but like, what would that sound like for like an A school? Can you just talk me through what that might sound like?
Well, I hadn't really put any specific proposal together, but an A school would have a graduation rate above X. It would have a dual enrollment above Y. you know, and look at each of the critical components that we've got in place, going back to slide 16 with the goals and priorities, look at each one of those goals and priorities and how do they fit at the high school level. And if you look at each one of those individually, an A school does all of them, I would think, very well. And then we just want to quantify very well. But I think slide 16 is your reference. And then it's just a matter of how well the school or the student performs relative to the goals and the priorities in slide 16.
Would love to open it up to other reactions to that.
Because if we don't know, if we can't define an A school, or we can't differentiate or clearly articulate what differentiates an A school from a B school or a B school from a C school, then in my mind, we haven't set clear expectations for the people that are trying to achieve that level.
If there
Go for it, Thomas. Go for it. Yeah.
if there aren't other work group members with thoughts, I have just an offering.
Yeah, please.
Where you are trying to take us is where we want to go eventually. For me and for Ms. Orange Jones, as we put together the agenda, our thought was, let's dig into what are we measuring and do we think those things are measuring correctly? And then once we've really dug into that, we think we can get to that A, B, C, D, F conversation. But currently we have slides that lay out that need to be an A in Louisiana, right? An A on the assessment index is the student gets to mastery. An A on the growth index is students are reaching step 1, their growth to mastery target, or they're in that top 20% on growth. Same thing with that dropout credit accumulation index. Same thing with the graduation index. We could go through and lay out what those things are again, and I can share those slides around. But our thought was start here and then get there.
Yeah, and Ronnie, I personally appreciate the provocation. And I'd just love to know what other work group members think about that. Like, Michael, what is Ronnie's thoughts make you think? Belinda?
You're asking.
I want to jump in. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you.
Go for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
I think that Ronnie's right. We need to know what it is. And I appreciate what we're doing right now about how I just don't know which one
Comes first.
Yeah, I understand what Ronnie's saying is we have to have a goal that we're working towards. Right now, it kind of seems like to me, and I don't know if this is, again, I missed that last meeting. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but this more seems like an evaluation of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
And I'm appreciating where we're at now and going forward, but I do think Ronnie's right. We do need to have that goal of, okay, at the end, what is our end goal? And I don't know if it's right now in this one or if it's in a meeting or two when we get to because we've assessed where we're at. We've talked about what we like, what we don't like. Now let's go forward to the next and move on to it. But Ronnie's absolutely right. At the end, we need to say, we need to be able to define, this is what an A school is. This is what an F school is. And those are the two easy ones. It's the letters in between there, I think, that are hard.
Belinda, Sandy, any thoughts immediately on this?
I agree with Ronnie's expectation of the end result and what are the outcomes and why does this certain school have an A and versus the other. That's good thoughts, and it could be something in the background of our expectations as we work through this. So great thoughts. But can I, on that slide 18, I'm sorry, that's all I have to say. I think this is a great idea that Ronnie has to differentiate those levels. But on this conversation starter with the first 3 items, the thought I have here on the first 3 is, how can we do these 3 with knowing that our ACT is not aligned with our standards? So how can we align ACT expectations with TOPS, or measure the growth on ACT and increase weight? Our ACT is not aligned with the standards. And I know, Kay, Dr. Berman, you're working on that now. And so what's the timeline would probably be another question. What is the timeline of that particular project being accomplished before we can get into answering 1, 2, and 3 line items? Make sense? I mean, are we measuring appropriately when we know the standards are not aligned?
Yeah, I think Dr. Brumley, are you on still?
Yeah, I'm here. So this is a bit complicated because
Yeah, it is.
we have 2 different end results. We have, at the end of the road, we have an EOC test, or LEAP 2025. And at the end of a different road, we have an ACT test. And those tests are not the same test. And those tests do not necessarily survey the same material. But we only have one set of standards for English, math, social studies, and science that are the vehicle that we are driving to get somewhere. And where it becomes problematic is, in our state, we've elected to assess LEAP 2025 as well as ACT, but our kids can't experience 2 different set of standards along the way. And Kira, I don't know if you recall this, but very early on, I mean, 1.5 years ago, probably, we were talking about what should be the end result assessment or assessments at the high school level. And it does just become a little complicated when you have two different destinations, but you only have one high school trip.
Yeah, I do remember that. I'll leave that. Yep.
I think the thing that I would add, Ms. Holloway, is these changes will take time to roll out across the system, right? Like, we may not implement this any ACT adjustments next year. It might be a cohort from now. It might be 3 years. It might be, we have time, right? As we think about alignment around those standards. But what I'll say is, we're currently measuring schools on ACT, even though these 2 things are not aligned. So nothing really changes there, except we start to align incentives slightly differently, would be my offer.
This is Jen. I just want to bring back to when we were talking about defining A, B's, and C's, that kind of thing. This is, our accountability system satisfies the federal requirement to test schools annually and evaluate schools annually based on the test scores. So I think we are, using this for many reasons, as, to satisfy many things. And I just want to remind the group of that, we're putting everything into one evaluation tool, and it's doing a lot for us. So that is really the purpose of the accountability system. And I just wanted to bring us back to that.
It's great. I think this is rich. Maybe we keep moving.
We're essentially at next steps. So other thoughts on high school, or if folks want to dig into that conversation, around A, B, C, D, F while we're here. Kind of get that in our notes. Otherwise, the next steps will be for me and Amelia to get with you, Ms. Orange Jones, and any work group member that might be interested in working with us on the high school stuff.
Yeah. Belinda, are you still there?
I am, yep. And I did want to say that we had briefly discussed, I think Ronnie brought up the idea of, how are we, when we're thinking about how we're doing, what are we measuring ourselves against how other districts and other states are doing. And the Stanford Education Data Archive was mentioned. So I did take a look at that this past week. And I'll just say a couple of things about that data archive. First, it's only available for, I think it's like 2008 to 2013 right now. So those researchers haven't gotten grant money to update it. So that's not going to be useful for us. And it takes a lot of money to collect all of those NAEP scores and to standardize them, in addition to collecting every state's data sets. So there's that. And then when you look at how researchers are using that right now, nobody that I have found yet, and I've just started doing a research search, there's lots of use of those data to compare districts, but not schools. And so I'm looking into whether or not, why is it that so many people are using it at district and state levels, but not at schools? Because that would obviously be what we would need to use something like that for. And so I just wanted you to know that I am looking into that, and I could see that there would be problems with it. Kira, did you have a question for me when you asked me if I was still around?
I just knew we'd had some conversation about high school. I just wanted to see what you thought about this slide. Yeah.
Well, so first, if by bullet point 2, align ACT expectations with top requirements means giving students or districts and schools points for a 17, I am absolutely in favor of that, because if we are going to be so heavily reliant on tops, along with having an increased emphasis on obtaining credentials, right? And then a lot of those are going to be on the career and technical path. It makes no sense to me to not recognize a 17 on the ACT score when that can get you VOTEC tops. So that to me seems like what should be a very common sense fix. And again, like I am less concerned about the discrepancy between high school letter grade distributions and elementary and secondary, or elementary and middle school grade distributions, because I think that they're doing two different things. And so maybe this is because I talk to Doris too much. But Doris will tell you that when you get a kid in high school, right, your job is to figure out how to get them ready to be productive members of society over the next 4 years, whether or not that's preparing them for a 4-year college, a community college, whether or not it's getting them into apprenticeships. And so so I think that the diversity of ways that we look at our high schools right now is appropriate. I don't think that we need to necessarily move more towards a greater reliance on assessments the way we have things at the K-8 level. So for me, if we could figure out a way to recognize 17s on the ACT, I think that would be one step in the right direction. And I don't know, Ronnie and I have had conversations in the past about, we used to value attendance. And so we know that truancy right now is a big deal in the state. But that would be something that we might need to think about, not just for high school, but also K-8, though I do think, I guess that creates lots of maybe burdens for districts in terms of what they report to the state. I don't really know, but from the high school perspective, for me, a big priority is getting points for a 17. And then also, quite frankly, right, at least mimicking in some way the proposed changes to the high school accountability in terms of recognizing credentials and increased dual enrollment credits, those kinds of things. Did that make sense, Kira?
Yeah, I was muted. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Belinda.
Okay, so our next steps are out of the progress index conversation, a set of conversations with Dr. Davis, Ms. Orange Jones, Mr. Morris, to get us ready for the next meeting. And then Ms. Orange Jones, me, and if any other work group members are interested in doing a similar thing around the high school components to figure out what our next steps are so that we can have really rich conversation on those two things at the next meeting. We'll also do some thinking around that A, B, C, D, F conversation and how we can bring that up again. I know it's come up a couple times in various meetings that we've had together.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so let me just share with folks a little bit about how I'm thinking about the various work streams that we have going here, and anyone could feel free to amend this, but we have the work we're doing right now, which is about trying to deepen our own understanding of some of these important dimensions of the formula. And today we've looked at growth and we've looked at high school, prioritized by our last conversation. What we haven't done is the body of work around engagement that would enable us to have a set of design principles ultimately for the formula, right? Which we've all also said matters. And so I just wanted to come back to that again, which is the piece around stakeholder engagement, and get a sense from this group on just the level of importance around that piece to each of you. How vital does that feel? Because essentially that then feeds into some of these conversations that we've had today, because obviously that would inform a set of design principles, which have implications for any one of these areas. So I just want to revisit the stakeholder engagement piece and find out from work group members, does it feel as critical? What do you hope to gain from that? Because that's another parallel work that we're going to have to kick off soon.
I mean, I feel the stakeholder engagement group piece is really important, because I'm tired of, like, I felt like lots of times we would go into meetings and kind of be blindsided by the fact that the accountability piece was not moving forward. And I think that some, not all of it, but a big chunk of it was a function of stakeholders raising concerns, and sometimes even at the last minute, and derailing steps forward. And so for me, I would like to hear out of their mouths, right, what exactly it is that they think we ought to be doing with the accountability system. So we then as a group can kind of weigh the totality of what people out there are asking for. And then we, as the people that are tasked with making the decisions on this, we come together and we, having listened to them thoughtfully, and based on what we have learned through this process as we've dug in deep to this ourselves, we can come up with an accountability system that can move forward, or changes to the system that can move forward.
I agree with Dr. Davis. I think stakeholder impact or input is vitally important. And it doesn't matter whether it's stakeholder meetings, advocacy groups, schools, teachers, parents, students themselves. If a student is old enough to articulate, this is what I like, this is what I don't like. I think that diversity of opinions and feedback will bring up points that we otherwise may overlook or not think of. And look, it's feedback. It's not guaranteeing that we're going to implement everything everybody says or suggests, but the more we know and the more differing views we can have, I think the more likely we are to get to something that we're comfortable with and that we can recommend adopting to move the state forward.
That's on the agenda for the next meeting, and we'll bring a straw man to the meeting for folks to react to.
That's fantastic, Thomas. And you agree that it's really like two different strands that eventually will come together, because we're doing a body of work now trying to build our own understanding, and then this feedback will directly inform our thinking once we have it.
That's right.
And I think maybe Kate, if you can take a minute and talk through why you think design principles are going to be really important to this process. I know that's something that you felt very convicted around.
Yeah, thanks, Kira. I would just add that stakeholder engagement is really important, for many obvious reasons. And I think that it should just be part of the design principle and an accepted fact of a body of work that we're going to do in some way. Beyond that, I have felt from the beginning that values decisions are also really important on what we're trying to accomplish. And just a very simple explanation of what I mean by that would be, even with the high school piece, like, for a long time, there's been a values judgment made that college preparation or college going is valued more than true high wage career and technical education that might not necessarily require going to a four-year institution. And I just think that, as a values judgment for me, I'm owning this. Like, if we could say, students, here is a menu of opportunities for you, and they're all equally worthy, and we're going to reward schools equally for these things around college and career readiness.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is an example from me of a values decision that I think should be driving the work. But, I, like the rest of you, have many examples of that. And so I think we need to get to a point where we kind of lay those things out and agree upon some of those things.
Great.
Hey, Kira, I was just thinking of something while we were talking through it as an idea to throw out there as we work towards this piece of it. I think it would be great if we could have like a panel discussion with the work group members, and each member could maybe take one meeting that we, one of these work group meetings, and talk about what you all looked at. What are the pros and cons? What are some of the myths? What are the concerns? What were the ideas, and how you arrived at some of your conclusion, your final record, or you're working towards, depending on when you had it. I think it would be, and of course, be open to the public, and it would be 2 or 3 hours. I think it would be really helpful, as opposed to just trying to jam everything into when y'all came up with your final recommendations at a board meeting and limited all public comments to 3 minutes and that kind of thing. So it's just a thought, I think if we could have a really rich discussion as opposed to just a quick advisory council meeting or a board meeting.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks for that, Shan. Okay, so Thomas, why don't you take us through our next steps, and then our work group will either add to this or okay it, and we're good to go.
Sounds good. We're going to share these slides shortly with you all, so you have them for your records. Later this week, we'll share those progress index, assessment index, case studies that we went through a couple of today. Got some feedback on those that we're going to make some changes and send your way. Prior to the next meeting, we will share that issue tracker that I previewed with you all, and we'll group those issues into target months to resolve. Several work group members and I will get together on the progress index. I'll get together with the chair on the high school stuff before the next meeting, and the next meeting topics will center around our feedback and input gathering process, timeline, that kind of stuff. Values and design principles, we'll dig into that some more. Student growth and the high school formula.
Great, and I want to come back to Mr. Morris's point around, which I think Michael agreed with, which was like clarifying what an A means, like that becomes a part of it almost seems like that's a part of the design principle conversation. Is that correct? Do you see it that way, Thomas?
I do.
Ronnie, do you see it that way?
Yeah, I just feel like we need to be clear on expectations. And once we can articulate those expectations, then we can communicate that to the broader group, the stakeholder group. And then we're aligned on expectations and where we're going to set the bar, which is a huge step in itself. And then once we establish those expectations for each grade where the bar is set, then we start having that conversation about how to incentivize growth or progress along that pathway, as well as how to remove obstacles that may be there today. So I think it's definitely integral to the process.
Okay. All right, well, let's capture it here. This looks good to me. Does anybody have any amendments? All right. I think we've got it.
Thanks, everybody. I'll
Thank
send out
you.
a doodle poll for the next meeting date.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you. Great
Bye.
job.
Okay. Bye, everyone.